Once again, we find ourselves thrown into the trenches of the First World War. War has always been brutal, but the Great War was something else entirely. Relentless mud, disease, and the constant shadow of death from shelling or sniper fire. Soldiers endured nightmarish conditions, plagued by rats, lice, and crippling illnesses like trench foot and trench fever. And beyond the physical suffering, there was the heavy psychological toll of a bloody stalemate that seemed to have no end. Still, out of that suffering came stories unlike anything else. Paranormal encounters that live on to this day. Tales like the Angels of Mons, ghostly archers said to appear in the darkest moments to turn the tide of battle. Or the Hound of Mons, whispered to be a terrifying German experiment, set loose in the night to hunt down British soldiers. Then there are the countless stories of soldiers, visited by dead friends or family. Some came to say goodbye, others to warn of looming danger. These experiences, shared by men on both sides of the conflict, gave the war a mythology all its own, one that continues to captivate both historians and paranormal enthusiasts. But ghosts and cryptids weren't the only legends whispered between the trenches. There was another tale, one that carved out its own chilling place in the history of war. Something far rarer to see, but often heard. Creatures that wore the uniforms of British, French, and German soldiers, but who were no longer men at all. They had abandoned their humanity. The daylight, they shunned. It was only when the sun dipped below the horizon that these beings were said to emerge from their underground lairs. Like animals, they lived only to survive. And like animals, they showed no mercy to any uniform, robbing, killing, even feeding on those unfortunate enough to cross their path. This is the story of the wild men of no man's land. The mist that hangs before you offers a choice: step through or turn. Step through or turn back. Beyond it lies stories that defy explanation, legends that challenge the line between fact and superstition. Here, in the fog of war, only you can decide what to believe. Afternoon, sir. Didn't expect to see cavalry out this way. We weren't expecting to see anyone. What brings you here, sir? We're on something of a wild goose chase, I'm afraid. A couple of Jerry prisoners broke out, and we've been sent to track them down. Well, I suppose they've got to make use of us Aussies somehow. I'd wish you luck, sir, but finding anyone out here? Old trenches, dugouts, ruins for miles. Plenty of places to hide. I think you're right, Sergeant. We'll press on a bit further, then likely call it a night. Best you head back to the lines now, sir. You don't want to be caught out here when the sun goes down. Oh, why's that? I thought we'd cleared the Huns from this area. Not the Huns, sir, something else. By the autumn of 1918, after 4 long years of slaughter, the end of the Great War was finally drawing near. Soldiers dared to whisper about an armistice, though none could be sure when or if it would come. Still, the writing was on the wall. Germany's great spring offensive had failed, and the Allies had clawed back every inch of ground. Now, they pressed deeper into German territory, with no intention of stopping. And yet, while millions of British, French, and newly arrived Americans pushed forward, a young English cavalry officer named Arden Arthur Holme found himself pushed aside. For men like him, the age of the mounted cavalry was already over. Tanks, chlorine gas, and machine guns had erased the glory of horsemen charging into battle. Once the spearhead of the British Army, cavalry units were now relegated to the rear, performing far less glamorous duties. On this particular day, Bean and his unit had been sent to track down a group of escaped German prisoners of war. A straightforward mission, or so it seemed. But as Bean would later recall in his writings, the events that followed were anything but ordinary. During our patrol through that shattered landscape, we had one strange adventure. About 30 German prisoners had escaped from a cage some miles away, and our squadron was dispatched to round them up. We were warned from the outset that the task was nearly hopeless. The dugouts were endless, the trenches stretched on without end, and we could only move along the roads. Still, we set forth with determination, resolved to do our best. Communication in that desolate country was nearly impossible, and the area we were to search was vast. So we moved according to a carefully prepared plan. I accompanied the skipper at the head of the support troop. In one place with Th. We moved on with a carefully worked-out plan. I rode alongside the skipper at the head of the support troop. At one point, with the troop carefully concealed, We raised our glasses and watched a small copse that had just been searched by the men ahead of us. The moment the last horse of that troop vanished from sight, we saw him. A man in German uniform stepped cautiously to the edge of the trees, glancing around. Our hearts leapt. We formed line and galloped toward the copse, thrilled with the thought of catching our quarry so quickly. The place couldn't have been more than 50 yards square. But as we closed in, the man disappeared inside. For an hour we searched every inch, every dugout honeycombing the ground, every patch of open country around it. Nothing, not a trace. Greatly puzzled, we pulled away. But once we were out of sight, we wheeled our horses, galloped down a sunken lane, and crept back to our first position. Again we watched. Minutes passed, and then another man stepped out of the trees. Someone who must have been there the whole time we'd been searching. Once more, we spurred our horses across the field, and this time we caught him. But to our astonishment, he wasn't German at all. He was a French civilian, the only one from our village. The first had been a German, the second a Frenchman. And if both of them had managed to hide so well, then surely the escaped prisoners must be concealed there too, in some clever dugout we had missed. But from our captive, we could get no information. Once again we searched the copse, and once again, nothing. Finally, we sent the Frenchman back under guard and left men posted to watch that baffling wood, while the rest of us pressed on. The farther we advanced, the more broken the country became. Our pace slowed, slower and slower, until we found ourselves in the old front system, the wildest terrain I had ever seen. The war had rolled on from there toward the Hindenburg Line. The French had swept through, leaving devastation in their wake, and the land still bore the scars. Factories stood hideously dismantled, their machinery overgrown with grass. Food, munitions, even the unburied dead lay scattered everywhere. At a place called Fresnes, on the edge of this grim wasteland, we met a salvage company. They told us we were the first people they had seen since their arrival, and they laughed outright at our mission. Those warrens of trenches and dugouts stretched for miles upon miles. Searching them was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And they gave us a warning. If we insisted on pressing further, no man was to move alone, only in strong parties. For Golgotha, that blasted stretch of no man's land, was inhabited by wild men. British, French, Australian, German deserters. Men who had vanished underground like ghouls among the moldering corpses. At night, they prowled out to plunder and to kill. The officer told us how, after dark, mingled with the snarling of carrion dogs, they often heard inhuman cries and rifle shots. The sounds of wild men fighting amongst themselves. None of the salvage crew dared to venture past their camp once the sun had set. Once, they had even tried to bait them, leaving out a basket filled with food, tobacco, and whiskey. But the next morning, the basket sat untouched. Inside, a note, scrawled with just 2 words, "Nothing doing." Ardern Bean's account of wild deserters living in no man's land appears to be the very first of its kind. Official Allied and German records make no mention of such men. But when Bean published his memoir The Squadron in 1920, even that brief description of the wild men was enough to ignite the imagination and stir debate among scholars and armchair historians alike. Other veterans of the Great War, men who had lived through those same nights, read Bean's words and felt a chill. His story of deserters rang eerily familiar. It carried them back to the front line, to the chilling noises they had heard drifting from beyond the wired eye in the military. Desertion is defined as abandoning one's post without permission, usually with no intent to return. A physical reaction to the thought that haunted many soldiers. I didn't sign up for this. During the First World War, official records counted staggering numbers. The British Army lost 114,670 men to desertion. The Germans reported around 150,000. The French, nearly 67,000. And in the Russian and Austro-Hungarian forces, desertions reached well into the millions. It's easy to slap the label of cowardice onto these men, but the truth is far more complicated. Many deserted not because of fear, but because they no longer believed in the war they were ordered to fight. Others refused to march to certain death under incompetent leadership. And then there was shell shock, the psychological wounds no one yet understood. The brutality of combat was endless. Even the strongest, most hardened men could be broken. Records show that the first instinct of any deserter was simple: get as far away from the front as possible. But this was easier said than done. Behind the lines, the countryside swarmed with military police, and capture meant death, often by firing squad. So some devised another strategy, one nobody would think of. Instead of fleeing back, they fled forward, into no man's land itself. It isn't clear exactly when or where it started, but by the latter years of the war, stories of deserters living in the wasteland between the trenches had spread like wildfire across both sides. Some narratives painted them as harmless, ragged men hiding by day in dugouts, creeping out at night to scavenge just enough to survive until the war ended. There were even reports of wounded soldiers or downed pilots being helped by them, sometimes by figures in enemy uniforms. But most accounts told a darker tale. In these stories, deserters banded together in gangs, British, French, Australian, Canadian, German. By night, they prowled no man's land. Their motives were not only survival, but murder. They stripped the dead, killed the wounded, and raided trenches for food, weapons, and supplies. There was no honor among them. Factions turned on each other constantly. Soldiers on watch duty at night often heard the screams, the shouts, the scattered gunfire. At the time, they may have believed it was the enemy across the lines. But after the war, with their own rations missing, with ammunition stolen, and with accounts like beans in print, many veterans wondered if what they'd really heard were the wild men fighting over stolen spoils. Oh God, I can't take listening to him screaming like that. There's got to be a way to get him out. You don't want to be out there after dark. Peanut Grout's got snipers and raiders crawling all over. That's not all that's out there. Oh, here we go? Mac, cut it. Nobody believes that rubbish about some hound. Not the hound. I'm talking about the loonies out there. They'll kill that poor bastard and carve him into pieces for stew. All right, and who told you that? You know Freddie, over in Baker Company? Mac, you hear a lot of things. Most of it's wax in your ears. Fine, Shakespeare. Then explain this. The truth is detailed accounts of the wild men are scarce. Perhaps because they left no survivors. Perhaps because their stories bled into rumor, then into myth, until finally they faded from memory, lingering only in the minds of veterans. One such man was Walter Frederick Morris. In 1930, he authored a novel titled Behind the Lines, published in the U.S. as The Strange Case of Gunner Raleigh. Morris himself had first enlisted as an infantryman in the Norfolk Regiment. His leadership earned him an officer's commission, and by 27, he was already a major, commanding a battalion and decorated with the Military Cross. Though a work of fiction, Morris's novel drew heavily from his own wartime experience. The story follows Peter Raleigh, a young artilleryman who accidentally kills his overbearing commanding officer. Knowing he won't receive a fair trial, that a firing squad awaits him, Raleigh deserts, fleeing into no man's land. After wandering aimlessly, he meets another deserter, a British soldier named Alf. The two men form an uneasy partnership, with Alf leading Raleigh to his underground refuge. Raleigh squeezed through the hole, feet first. He found himself in a low, narrow tunnel, its timbers rotting, half blocked by fallen earth. The whole place reeked, musty, earthy, garlicky, like the lair of a wild beast. "Where do you draw your rations?" Raleigh asked. "Scrape by," Alf muttered. "We live like perishing fighters, sometimes. I swear to you. There's several of us, scattered through these trenches. Most of us work in pairs. Writers are at their best when they know their subject." And Morris's novel gives a chillingly detailed view of the life these wild men might have lived. His book alone is proof that the idea of deserters in no man's land has weight. Did Morris draw on first-hand experience with such men? Or did he weave together the rumors that drifted through the trenches? We may never know, but his story keeps the legend alive, telling the true stories of what he had seen and heard on the front lines. Maybe it was considered too somber, too visceral to capture the interest of publishers or readers who only wanted to move on from the tragedies of the war. Or maybe it was Morris's own desire to be seen as a creative writer rather than just a historian. But it's possible that the accounts of the wild men in this book held more truth than he ever admitted, and were simply taken as fiction only because they appeared in a novel. If that was the case, then perhaps, because there was no appetite for gore in fiction novels of the time, Morris chose to leave out the darker, more disturbing elements of the stories he'd heard from the front lines. Maybe it was to avoid offending his publisher, his readers, or perhaps both. But the fact remains there are some very dark stories that eye in some Wildman accounts. Deserters weren't just scavengers or outlaws. They had completely lost their minds. The chaos of war had stripped them down to something primal, animal-like, until they no longer resembled the men they once were. Like predators, they did whatever it took to survive, stealing, killing, even cannibalism when the rations were gone. During daytime infantry assaults, many soldiers were cut down instantly by machine gun fire or relentless shelling. Those who survived but were badly wounded would stumble or crawl into shell holes scattered across the desolate battlefield. There, they would wait, sometimes for days, crying out for help, hoping a medic or a fellow soldier might find them. But ceasefires and truces were rare. Retrieving the fallen was almost impossible. More often than not, these men were left stranded, alone, waiting for death. You can imagine their relief when, after losing all hope, they finally heard footsteps approaching, a rescue party, at last. But their hope was shattered when they looked up and saw not comrades, but cold, lifeless eyes staring down at them. A deranged man stood at the edge of the crater, bayonet fixed. Then another appeared, and another. Disheveled men in ragged uniforms, looking less like soldiers and more like a hungry pack of wolves that had just cornered an injured deer. Moments later, several hundred yards away, men sitting watch in the trenches would hear a scream pierce the night, only to be silenced just as quickly. Afternoon, gentlemen. I know you're all looking forward to some well-earned rest, but special orders have come through, straight from the top. Special orders, sir? Didn't the Jerrys just surrender? It seems we won't be facing Germans this time, I'm afraid. Well, not exactly. This mission is strictly off the books, lads. If anyone asks, you know nothing of what we're about to do. Understood? Yes, sir. I know I've asked the impossible of you time and time again, and it pains me to do it once more, especially now, after the armistice. But orders are orders. Double-check your weapons and kit, and make sure your gas masks are in proper working order. But, sir, what exactly are they having us do? To say that Sir Osbert Sitwell was a colorful character would be an understatement. Born in 1892 into British nobility, Sitwell first enlisted as a cavalry officer with the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry in 1911. But he quickly realized the cavalry life wasn't for him. He soon transferred to the Grenadier Guards, just in time for the outbreak of war in 1914. Sitwell saw his fair share of combat, including the brutal Battle of Loos in 1915, where many of his men and several of his close friends were killed. The hardships of war, combined with his complex views on the conflict, drove Sitwell to journaling and poetry as an outlet for his torn emotions. While he was moved by the acts of bravery and heroism he witnessed, he became deeply disillusioned with the war as a whole. In the years that followed, Sitwell pursued many paths, even a brief career in politics, but writing was his true passion. From 1943 to 1950 are often revealing. The many strange and unexplained stories from the First World War at least help us to see the conflict through the eyes of the men who actually lived it. Not from a scholar, not from a historian analyzing years later from an academic distance, but from the soldiers themselves. The ones who heard the screams and the gunshots, who felt the raw, visceral terror of their own death hanging over them every single day, who saw firsthand how war could drive men into madness. Yes. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around here for the after-action in the credits. Very quickly, as you noticed in the story, many veterans of the Great War came home and wrote about their experiences, some even becoming published authors. And I've been in touch with a writer named Jake Barrett for a few years now, waiting for the right opportunity to share his work with you. His first published book is titled Trench 1915, The Dawn of Modern Warfare. Like Frederick Morris, the veteran author we spoke about earlier, Jake's book is a fictional account, but it is no less rooted in the real truth of how the war unfolded. The story follows a secretive elite German unit, led by two men, Maxis and Lothar. Jake has spent years studying Great War history. He even has family ties to veterans. And in his writing, he truly captures the grim realities, the horrors, and also the moments of bravery. His storytelling is drawn from the voices of those who lived it, soldiers' memoirs, diaries, journals. It pulls you directly onto the battlefield, often in first person, so vividly that you feel like you're there. It's an experience you can't really get from films, only through the detail and intimacy of reading. So, if you're an avid reader, if you're a fan of war history, I highly recommend you check out Trench 1915 and Jake's other work. As for this episode, one thing I want to say is that researching these stories takes time. And with deadlines to hit, the depth of research can only go as far as the hours and resources allow. There isn't some master archive, no single, well-organized, digital repository of soldiers' memoirs that you can just browse. Jake Barrett knows this better than anyone. He spent years digging to put his book together. One of the common challenges with these stranger stories is just how hard they are to find. They're hidden, buried in the pages of books that aren't even focused on the paranormal. Maybe just a few lines, maybe a couple of pages. Or they're memories that were never written down, passed only by word of mouth until someone finally recorded them, secondhand, or even thirdhand. And it makes you wonder, how many untold stories are still out there? How many experiences lie hidden in old diaries and journals, gathering dust with family heirlooms in an attic or basement somewhere? And how many more died with the men and women who lived them? Those who chose silence, who never spoke of what they saw, out of fear of ridicule. In my mind, these stories exist for a reason. Whether they're true or born from a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable, they matter. The more I read, the more I see that these strange battlefield accounts are as much evidence of the paranormal as they are proof that man was not made for war. Because war shatters the mind in ways nothing else can. No one has ever had their mind broken by living a peaceful life, free from fear, free from pain and death. Quick question for you. Do you ever listen to these stories as you fall asleep? Maybe that's part of the comfort they bring, as gruesome as they can be sometimes. They remind us of how fortunate we are, lying in a warm bed, far away from any battlefield, not trapped inside a muddy hole, too terrified to close our eyes because we don't know if we'll ever open them again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing.